So you've been building your game for a while now. Your character moves around, you've got your NPCs, and maybe even a few gameplay mechanics set up. But then it hits you. Something's missing. Something that can bring your world to life, make it more immersive, and give your players a reason to care. Something like dialogue. But then you're reminded of instances where a developer is getting criticized online for not being the best programmer out there. Maybe you've heard of them creating things like massive switch statements for every single line of dialogue, or even stuffing everything into giant arrays with no structure or flexibility. And you're left wondering, okay, but what's the right way to do it? Now, to be fair, the examples I mentioned come from GameMaker developers. I don't know much about GameMaker, but I do know Unity. So in this video, I'll walk you through creating a proper dialogue system in Unity. We'll start with a quick UI setup, move into NPC interaction, and then build out the actual dialogue system. The dialogue system we'll create will be very minimal, but it will do the job. And now let's roll the intro. My name is Esper, I work as a freelance game developer, and I'm also a Unity asset publisher. My goal is to create assets that empower passionate indie game developers to help bring their dream games to life. All of my assets are available in the Unity Asset Store, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. Some of my assets are even free, so even if you prefer to not pay anything, it's worth it to check them out. However, I'd highly recommend checking out my paid assets as they are either much easier to use, packed with more features, or both. By the way, I recently decided to try out content creation, so I'd appreciate any feedback, positive or negative. Now let's get on with the video. Just as a quick note, I'll be starting off with a scene I created in a previous tutorial about creating a third-person character controller. This does not mean that this tutorial won't be valid for any other controller type. In fact, I'll let you know what you need to do differently if you're using a different character controller setup. The first thing we're going to do is create a text box that will display our dialogue. Let's start by adding an image. Adjust its size and anchor it to the bottom of the screen. Hold Alt so that it also updates the position. Now we can just move it up and add some padding. Also change its color. I'm going to make it transparent black. I'll just rename it to Dialog Canvas for now. Add a text object as a child of the image. Hold Alt and stretch it completely. Now add some padding so the text isn't right on the edges. Alright, now I'm just going to test the text box to see how much dialogue it can fit. Well, that seems good to me. Before we move on, let's rename these objects accurately. We can now move on to the scripting side of the dialog box. Create a mono behavior script called dialog box. Add this script to the dialog box object. And now let's open the script. We're going to start by adding two fields that we will be able to set from the inspector, which are the content game object and the dialog text. Use the serialized field attribute to make private fields visible in the inspector. Save the script and switch back to Unity. You can see the fields on the dialog box component. Drag the content and dialog text objects to the appropriate fields. Switch back to your script. What we're going to do next is simply make the dialog box publicly accessible. Add a public static property called instance with a public getter and private setter. Add the awake method and make instance equal to this object. Now other scripts will have a simple way of accessing the dialog box. We need a way to open and close the dialog box. So here I'll just add a method called open that will enable the content object, and a method called close that will disable the content. Okay, pretty simple stuff. Now we need a way to display the text. And this is where things get a little complicated. In many games, the full dialogue text isn't shown right away. Sometimes it's written out letter by letter, which is known as the typewriter effect. Games use this effect to control pacing and enhance immersion by making text feel more alive and readable. It also gives devs the ability to make text more expressive by adding sounds, delays, or effects at the right timings. So how do we add this? First, let's add the fields we'll be using. Create a text speed field that will control the text speed. Then add a string field called full text that will contain the full dialog text. Add a boolean property that will be used to track if the dialog is currently being typed. Also add a property that we can use to check if the dialog box is currently open. Let's make sure the dialog box is closed at the start. Now let's add a method called displayDialog that will set the full text and start the typewriter effect. We'll use a coroutine to handle typing, so let's create one called the typewriter effect coroutine. Start the coroutine by setting the dialog text empty, and also pre-calculate the per character delay. And now let's loop through each character in the full text field and add it to the dialog text display one by one. We're running the delay here so that there's a short pause per character. And now simply set is typing to false because at this point it's finished typing. We can also add fast forwarding. It's pretty simple. Create a method called fast forward. This needs to stop the typing coroutine if it's running, set the dialog text to full text immediately, and then set is typing to false. And there we go, that completes our dialog box script. Now I can switch over to Unity and enter play mode to test it. By the way, I added this test code in Awake so that it actually runs some dialog. Great, it's working. The text is pretty slow, so I'm just going to increase the speed and test it again. Okay, now it looks good. You'd likely want to prevent the player from moving and looking around while dialog is running, but I'm not going to go over that in this video. I can give you an idea. I'd recommend adding events that will be invoked when the dialog box is opened and closed. Then, from the inspector, you can add events that enable and disable your character controller accordingly. As you can see it now, I'm unable to move or look around while the dialog box is enabled. Now we can move on to interaction. So by now you know I've already assumed you have some kind of character controller setup, which means you have input going as well. To set up interaction, you need to extend your input buttons and add a keybind that will be used as the interact button. I'm going to use the E button as my interact key. You can use whichever button you'd like. How you need to set this up will depend on your project. If you're using the old input system, you don't need to do anything for now. If you're using the new input system, you would need to open the player's input actions asset and add a new binding from there. I'll create a new binding called interact and add the appropriate keybinds. I'll add one for both a keyboard and controller. Alright, so I have some NPCs here. If you don't have NPCs set up, just use whatever model you have lying around. We're going to set up the NPC's interaction range. We can do this by giving them a box collider with isTrigger set to true. If your game is 2D, you would add a 2D box collider instead. So let's set this up real quick. Set isTrigger to true. And now let's start adjusting its size. Click this button here so that you can adjust the size through scene view. The box size should represent where the player could possibly stand to be able to interact with the NPCs, so the exact size of the box is up to you. I'll just fast forward the rest of this. Okay, that looks good. Now let's quickly create a script called speaker NPC. Open it up and just leave it as an empty class for now. Give this script to all NPCs that the player can talk to. We also need to create an interaction script. Create a new script and call it interactor. Give this script to your player. Open the script and remove the methods. So this is where we will handle our input key logic. The logic will vary slightly depending on your input system of choice. First of all, create a method called interact. If you're using the old input system, add the update method. Create an if statement that checks if your interact button has been pressed. and then call the interact method. If you're using the new input system, add a method called onInteract. This will be called automatically by the input system because we named our interact keybind interact. Inside this method, call interact. So because I'm using the new input system, I'm going to comment this out. Do not do this if you're using the old input system. Before we work on our interact method, switch to the speaker NPC script. We need to keep track of the current NPC that the player is in range of. Since we're using the physics system to see if the player is close enough to the NPCs, the logic will vary slightly based on whether your game is 3D or 2D. If, like me, you're using rigid body, you're going to need to add the onTriggerEnter and onTriggerExit methods. These will also work if you're using the character controller component instead of rigid body. If you're using rigid body 2D, you're going to have to add the onTriggerEnter 2D and onTriggerExit 2D methods. So the top two work with the rigid body and character controller. The bottom two work with the rigid body 2D. If your character controller uses none of these components, I'd recommend adding either a rigid body or rigid body 2D and setting is kinematic to true. This way the rigid body won't affect your character, but it will still detect collisions. Now we're going to create a list that will keep track of all NPCs currently in range of the player. The enter methods should add this speaker to the list if the player is detected. Interactor is technically the player in this case. The exit methods should remove the speaker from the list. I'm just going to do the same thing for the 2D version as well. Now let's create a method that will return the speaker closest to a specific position. This will be used to determine which speaker is the closest to the player. So first, let's make sure the speaker is not null. Then let's order them by distance. And now let's get the closest speaker, which is the first one in the list, and return it. We also need a method called trigger dialog. Add some default text for now. Now let's check if the dialog box is not open. If so, open it and display the text. Else, if it is open and text is being typed out, simply fast forward. Otherwise, just close the dialog box. Now go back to the interactor script. In interact, we'll simply get the closest speaker to the player and trigger dialog. Alright, now let's test it. I'm just going to try talking to both of my NPCs. And it works. And that's all for interaction. I think our dialog box deserves an update. If we don't want to confuse the player, we should make it very obvious as to who's currently speaking. We can do this by adding a display name for the current speaker. So let's add a new text object, anchor it, and move it so that it appears at the top of the box. Maybe set some default text as well. Rename the object to name text. Now let's update our dialog box script. Add a new text field called name text. In the display dialog method, add a new parameter which will be the name of the speaker. Now make name text equal to the name of the speaker. Switch to speaker NPC. For now, we will just provide the name of the object to the display dialog method. Switch back to Unity and drag the name text object into the new dialog box field. We can now move on to the core of our dialog system. To create a dialog system that is clean and manageable, we can use Unity scriptable objects. Scriptable objects are a special type of asset used to store data independently of game objects and scenes. They are data containers designed to be inherited from, which is perfect for our dialog system. But the first thing I want you to do is create a folder called resources. Inside this folder, create one called dialogues. This is where we will keep all of our dialogue scriptable objects. Any asset in the resources folder can be loaded at runtime with ease. Now let's create a new script, but this time it won't be a mono behavior script. It will actually be a scriptable object. Name it dialogue and open the script. You'll see the create asset menu attribute at the top. This will add a new option in the create menu. Let's just change the menu name to dialogue system. We're going to start by creating a struct called line. This represents a single line of dialogue from a single character. Since we have characters, let's define them with an enum. In my case, the characters are Robo, Pinky, and Goldie. You can write the names of your own characters here. Create a public field called character. This way, we won't have to type out the character name each time. We'll be able to select it through the inspector. Since enums don't allow all string characters, we should add a method to return the dialogue character names as plain strings. This way, we can include special characters like periods or apostrophes if required. Create a method called getCharacterName, which will return a string. Create a switch statement and write character inside the brackets. Maybe not all IDEs support this, but if you press the down key at this point in Visual Studio, it should automatically add all enum cases. For each case, I'll simply return the name of the characters. For the default case, I'll just return unknown. Now add a string field called text, which we will use to enter the dialog text through the inspector. Finally, create a list of lines. Also, make sure the line struct is serializable. Now we should be able to add dialog lines from Unity. So switch to Unity, head over to your dialogues folder, right click and navigate to create a dialog system and then click dialog. I'll just name it test. So from the inspector, you can see the line list we created. You can add lines, set the character, and write the dialog text. I'll just make Robo and Pinky say hi to each other. We can't use this yet, so let's switch back to the dialog script. So now we're going to make it easy for ourselves to load a specific dialog scriptable object through code. Create a public static method called load that will return a dialog object. Add a string parameter called relative path. This would be everything after the path to the dialog folder, including the name of the object. Inside the method, simply return a dialog loaded from resources. The root folder is dialogues, and we'll just combine the relative path with it. So just as an example, don't follow along here, I just want to make sure that you understand. I'll create two dialogues in different locations. This code here will load this object, and this code will load this object. Basically, just include all subfolders to the object from the dialogues folder and include the name of the object itself. This just makes it a little faster to load dialogues through code. Alright, so now we can move on to actually making our characters use the dialog object. In our dialog box script, we needed to increment through each dialog line in a dialog object. Create a dialog box field called active dialog and an int field called dialog index. Change the display dialog method to start dialog and make it accept a single dialog parameter, since that's now what contains both our speaker's name and full text. Set the active dialog to dialog and set the dialog index to 0. Also call open. We can just remove the rest of the code. Now add a method called next. This will increment and display the next dialog line. However, if dialog is being typed out, it should simply fast forward. Get the current dialog line. Set the name display text to the character name. And set the full text as well. Set as typing to true and start the dialog typewriter coroutine. Finally, increment the dialog index. In our start dialog method, call next. I almost forgot, in the next method, make sure the dialog box will close once all the lines have been displayed. Also, ensure nothing happens if there is no active dialogue. Switch to the speaker NPC script. Add a public dialog field called dialogue. This will allow us to set a dialogue through the inspector and through code if we need to. Now let's remove all this code and trigger dialogue and simply start the dialogue. Also ensure nothing happens if there is no dialogue set. Switch to the interactor script and let's make our interact method call next if the dialog box is open. If not, we'll trigger dialogue on the closest NPC. But we also need to make sure that there is an NPC in range, otherwise it'll result in an error. Okay, that's done. So I'm just going to give Pinky a dialog object. Now we can enter play mode to test it. So I can talk to Pinky here. If I try to talk to Goldie, nothing happens because I haven't given it a dialogue, which is exactly how I want it to work. At this point, we're done creating the dialogue system. But I do want to go over a couple things quickly, the first one being localization. Implementing localization support is easier than it seems. Just go to your dialog script and add a public static field called locale code. Now create text fields for all the locales you want to support. I'll just add support for English and Spanish. You can name the fields however you'd like. Personally, I prefer it like this. Now create a method that will return the correct string based on the locale code set. Call it getLocaleText. Create a switch statement and add cases for each locale you want to support. It doesn't have to be a locale code specifically, you can have the full name of the language or simply create an enum as your list of all languages that you want to support. Then update the dialog box script and call the getLocaleText method. By the way, to use a different locale, you would have to change the locale code or whatever your field is at runtime from any script like this. Also, it would be a good idea to use the text area attribute on the text fields. You will then get larger text boxes in the inspector. And that's it, you now have localization support. This is just one way to do it, it's not the only way. I'd recommend connecting this to Unity's localization package. That would be ideal, but this method works too. The next thing I want to touch on is dynamically changing the dialogue at runtime. What I mean by this is simply changing the dialogue of an NPC based on your own logic. This would be useful if the dialogue of your characters changes over time, maybe due to progress in the story. This would depend on your own game. I'll just give an example of dialogue that changes over time, like literally over time. First, I'll create two dialogue objects with different text. I'll be loading these two objects at runtime. Now I'll create a monobehavior script called dynamic dialogue. In the script, I'll start by getting the NPC. Next, I'll create a coroutine that will loop infinitely and make the NPC's dialogue alternate between the two dialogue objects I created. I can do this by yielding code execution for a second and then loading and setting the dialogue object. Now I just need to give the script to my NPC and enter play mode. Watch the inspector here. Notice how it literally shows you that it's alternating between the two dialogues. So the dialogue displayed will be different depending on when I interact with the NPC. And that's it. I hope this example code helps you understand how you can logically change the dialogue. But did you know I already put together a free pre-built dialogue system on the Unity asset store called FeelSpeak. FeelSpeak is a node-based dialogue system with an emphasis on emotion expression. Out of the box, it supports emotions, choices, text sounds, voice lines, and some extra features here and there. If you want to get more out of FeelSpeak, there's a premium version with features like localization support for both text and voice lines, an action node that can trigger any method from a scene object, prefab, or scriptable object directly from dialogue, a boolean node for branching dialogue into separate paths with your own logic, a nest node which lets you reuse dialogue sequences by nesting one inside another, plus many more features that make it powerful and reliable. If you've made it this far into the video, congratulations! You're one of the few who know I'm actually giving away the full version of FeelSpeak to 10 lucky winners. Here's how it works. A giveaway will be active from September 8 to September 15. After this time, you won't be able to enter the giveaway. To enter the giveaway, click the Gleam link in the description and complete the actions listed to gain entries. After the giveaway is complete, 10 random winners will be selected. The winners will receive a code through email which they can enter in the Unity asset store to receive FeelSpeak for free. That's about all. Like the video if you learned something, subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. I'm working towards my first 100 subs, so every bit of support means a lot. If you'd like me to cover a specific topic in a future video, let me know by leaving a comment down below. And that's all from me for now. Have fun developing.